Martin Wolf, thank you very much for joining us today and agreeing to this interview. I would like first to start by addressing the Davos summit this year, where figures like Mark Carney spoke of a rupture in the world order. Do you agree with this analysis? And what would genuinely convince you that this time is structurally different than previous times?
I think I broadly agree with what Mark Carney said. Um, I mean, rupture implies that we know that it will never reverse. I think it's highly likely that it will never reverse, but this is still fairly early days, and one could imagine things happening that would change it, perhaps even dramatically. Uh, uh, the main cause of the rupture, though it's not the only one, um, is the re-election of Donald Trump as president of the United States. Now, um, Donald Trump represents a very specific set of ideas about the place of America in the world, about the nature of world power, about the negative sum nature of free trade, about the way in which America has been exploited, and of course, some very traditional ideas, very ultra conservative, I would say reactionary ideas about the way society should be organized, which makes him extremely hostile to the liberal democracies of Europe, notably, and of other allies. So, as long as Trump is there, we are in at least a crisis of the order. Um, it is, of course, possible to imagine that Trump will be defeated, and not only that he will be defeated, but that his movement will ultimately be repudiated. The really passionate MAGA uh, adherents are a relatively small proportion, relatively small. They're not a majority of Americans. They're possibly not even a majority of Republican voters. So it is possible to imagine that this will be reversed and reversed decisively. But it's also quite possible that it will not be, that either it will stay in power one way or the other, or that it will alternate in power. And if that's the case, then of course we are in a different world. And of course, there's the possibility, because there's the possibility, people have to hedge against it. So that also causes the rupture. So I think the change in the United States is pretty fundamental, and something very big would have to happen to convince us that we're back to the business as usual in some sense. And then the other really big thing that has happened, of course, in the last 20 years is the rise of China. Now, China is a superpower in many dimensions, increasingly economically, and it clearly doesn't play by the standard rules as we understand them in international relations. It isn't militarily aggressive as the United States is, but it's an extremely autocratic, one might say, totalitarian society. It has it's hyper interventionist in its industrial and economic policies. It is focused ferociously on achieving supremacy in in advanced technology. And again, that makes it's very, very different from anything in the old order. So if you just look at the economics, um, uh, results of the Trump revolution and what's going on in China and their rivalry in the world looks profoundly different from what we imagined it will be 25 years ago. And of course, a lot of these anti-trade, anti-international cooperation, anti-climate change action forces can be seen all over the world, including in Europe. You could perfectly well imagine people with similar views being elected, say, president of France. So I do think it is plausible to believe, more likely than not, not certain, that we are undergoing a rupture and the world order that we had at least since the fall of the Soviet Union and in the West since the Second World War has gone for good.
You've spent decades defending open economic integration as the foundation of prosperity and ultimately peace. Yet today we seem to see that trade and finance and technology also are increasingly deployed as sort of strategic weapons, what, for instance, Farrell and Newman called the weaponization of interdependence. Doesn't that create a sort of tension at the heart of your liberal worldview that is perhaps becoming increasingly difficult to resolve?
Well, so the I wrote quite a bit about this in my first major book, which was on globalization. And I was rather clear about one essential point. I still believe that open economies with the right sorts of rules, there's a lot to be discussed there, and I discussed a lot of it in that book and more since then, um, are the best way for peace, freedom, and prosperity, as it were. Um, but crucially, uh, the order, any order, rests on power. It's very, very clear. And power is wielded by states. That the power has sort of always been wielded essentially by states since the agrarian revolution, the which began state formation, and ultimately the underpinnings of a liberal world order um, are provided by states that follow certain behavior in their own policies and defend this order. I suppose a very naive and simple view of the last 150 or so years of history, 200 years perhaps, is that in the 19th century, the power that provided much of the underpinnings of such a liberal order, though of course um, uh, blemished, more than blemished, to put it mildly, by empire, was Britain. And since 1945, it was the United States. And in between the two, Europe, which was very much still the center of world power and of the world economy, the most important part of the world economy, though the US was rising rapidly, fell into what one might describe as a great civil war, at least a period of war, and was the European states, as a result, were completely incapable of providing any sort of world order. And the US, which had been an outsider, had no interest in it. And that was a period of chaos. So I've always known, that's why I reacted so violently, vigorously to the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, that the sort of economic and political order I like isn't created by itself. It rests on states that want to provide it because they think it's in their interest and because it's in the interest of the world and that benefits them in different ways. And that's been particularly true, I think, of the US in the post-war, for much of the post-war period. For all its faults, it has believed that. And it has created institutions, strongly supported the creation of institutions that made that globally reasonably effective. Not perfect, nothing can be because power is still there. But if you look at the GATT, WTO, the IMF, World Bank, and so forth, the very idea of development as a cause is a post-war one. Nobody thought about it before then. So it's always seemed to me clear that it does rest on states. And that was part of my book, though obviously it's not the part people focused upon because, um, well, we took it for granted. In 2000, it seemed that everybody in the US was basically committed to this sort of world order. Now we're in a situation in which, for the reasons I've outlined, the major powers in the world are, for different reasons, not interested in it. in fact, to some significant degree, absolutely hostile to it. In this case, liberalism at the global level collapses, and of course, it collapses domestically too. Now, there is one final point. Of course, if the economy doesn't go well, and there were, I think, important reasons why the economy didn't go well, on which mistakes were made, then of course that reinforces the skepticism of people, and that makes it more difficult for political leaders to maintain what I think remains the best way of organizing the world economy, broadly speaking. So we've seen a reaction within countries that is reinforced and to some extent created by economic developments. Um, and to be honest, when I wrote my book in 2000, this is very different by 2010 after the financial crisis, but in 2000, I did not expect to be where we are now.
You've argued that sustained growth has historically underpinned democratic stability, that raising living standards made the compromises of liberal democracy tolerable. In a world of aging populations, maybe slower productivity growth and rising inequality, do you think that democracy can remain politically stable without a return to strong growth? And if not, what follows eventually?
Well, I think we are living in what my friend Larry Diamond, professor at Stanford, calls a democratic recession. And uh, and I have written some pieces in which I've referred to it as a democratic depression. It's pretty obvious that we are moving away from democracy very fast. The basic principles of liberal democracy, the rule of law, the need to obey constitutions, all these things, as well as fair voting, are all under challenge, to put it mildly, and not just in the United States, also in other countries. So the equality of citizens, for example, is one of the premises of liberal democracy. But it's pretty clear if you look at the way people are talking about immigrants in many countries, they don't believe in the equality of citizens. I mean, this is, I think, talking to somebody in France, the significance of that will be pretty obvious, will it not? So, given the history and role of France in extending this idea of the universal rights of citizens, wasn't that what the French Revolution was about? So we are living in a very different age in which ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism and traditional social orders have become very powerful forces. And I do agree with you that I agree with myself, as it were, in the way you put it, that one of the reasons for this is poor economic performance. The performance has been deteriorating for quite a long time. I've written a whole book, which Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which discusses this. I started writing it in 2016. To me, the trigger for my writing it was the aftermath of the financial crisis, the Eurozone economic crisis, financial crisis, and the backlash that these created. And I would say that I remain of the view that economic stagnation combined with aging, which means rising dependency ratios and therefore heavier fiscal burdens on the young, which shows itself also in declining birth rates, um, which is, I think, to my mind, among other things, a symptom of profound pessimism about the future. If young people don't have children, they're saying, compared with my own generation or previous generations, we're pretty pessimistic about the future. So it seems to me what we are seeing politically is in significant measure a reflection of the fact that economic prospects do not look as good as they did, say, to my generation or even my children's generation. They're in their 40s and 50s now. Um, so I feel that my thesis here, which is not in any way unique to me, other people, Benjamin Friedman, for example, wonderful professor at Harvard, wrote a magnificent book on the moral consequences of economic growth. That without growth, the optimism that liberalism needs, the trust that liberalism needs, the belief in the essentially beneficence of the civilization one lives in disappears, and you are likely to end up in a darker place, or even a very dark place. And of course, to the final comment, anybody who studied the history of the 20s and 30s knows, particularly in the 30s, that the consequences of the Great Depression, the most catastrophic event in modern times in the last 100 years of this kind, that this had a direct effect in destroying the legitimacy of democracy. We're just doing it more slowly.
Do you see Europe's current turn toward perhaps more industrial activism as a necessary, perhaps adaptation to this harsher world that we're facing, or more as a gradual abandonment of an open economic model that underpin its success? I guess my question is, what should Europe do, in your opinion?
Yeah, uh, I think there are two questions. What should Europe do? But that must be tempered by what can Europe do? The I've written quite a lot about this. China and the United States are states. They're very powerful states with very powerful governments. Europe is not a state, and Europe is not going to become a state. Uh, Personally, my view, which I expressed in many columns back in the early 90s when the Maastricht Treaty was being negotiated, was that Helmut Kohl was right and François Mitterrand was wrong in that Kohl believed that if we were going to have a currency union, we had to have a political union. It, and I remain of the view that Kohl was right. But of course, subsequent developments of the type we're now discussing would seem to me to make a political union, which means the ability to act as if in crucial respects Europe is a state, the EU is a state, is a necessary condition for being effective, because as things stand, and maybe this is inescapable, everything that is done collectively that matters, with a few exceptions, require agreement among all the major states. And that's true. It's not so true in trade policy, but anything that involves spending, anything that involves foreign policy action. Just look at the Hungarian veto just now on money going to Ukraine. How can this is like having a situation in which the United States foreign policy could be vetoed by Alabama. It would be ridiculous, right? Well, I mean, that's basically what's happened. Mr. Orban, who represents a tiny little country of no importance, has vetoed a very important European foreign policy action. Similarly, it has been impossible to implement the many sensible suggestions in the Letta and Draghi reports, which are widely agreed to be sensible moves in this direction, not all the way to a dirigee state, but exploiting the single market properly, getting rid of all the internal restrictions within the single market, trying to build a situation in which economies of scale can genuinely be exploited by European businesses within the market, trying to respond to Chinese mercantilism, which is obviously necessary, trying to decide, well, what are the sectors we must have just to give us necessary autonomy in this hostile world? These sorts of decisions, well, as things are, Europe can't make these decisions. It's just demonstrable because the countries don't agree. And of course, that agreement goes to the very center because on many very important things, France and Germany don't agree. And if France and Germany don't agree, then of course, it's been well known for a very long time, nothing happens. So I think on the one hand, this is a changing strategic environment in which, if Europe is to be relevant and even defend itself, properly defined, it needs to act together. But It can't. Making the steps necessary to do that may be impossible because ultimately a European government is not seen yet by enough people as a legitimate government. The legitimate government is the government of the nation state, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, all see themselves to a greater or lesser extent in this way. So Europe is paralyzed. Um, I would like to see more effective action by Europe. That doesn't mean I want it to become like China, and I certainly, God knows, and I certainly don't want it to become like the current United States. But it does seem to me Europe needs a capacity to act, which it doesn't currently have. And without that, it can't do some of the sensible, not fantastically radical, some of them are important, steps, take the necessary steps. Now, there are a few areas, the climate area, where Europe has acted, but if you look at it, the main activities, there are some exceptions, of Europe as a collective entity are regulatory. It's the capital of regulation. Well, that's in many ways some of what they're doing, I think, is rather good, but it's not enough. Regulation is about stopping things from happening, but you actually want things to happen, and that takes government action. And at the moment, I think Europe, for reasons which I discuss in one of, I think, my better columns, which go back to what happened after the fall of Rome. Europe was fragmented. Europe is deeply fragmented. And that's one of the reasons, in my view, Europe is so wonderful. I mean, I'm very caught as a child of European refugees from Europe, from the continent in the 30s, and passionate. I'm a European. But of course, the divisions of Europe were part of its creativity. But the divisions of Europe are also part of its weakness. How this will unfold, um, whether it can get over this and remain Europe but be more effective, I have no idea. But I am very concerned about it, and so are many of the most intelligent Europeans I know. I know all the people who've been engaged in these debates. Mario Draghi, for example, is a very good and admired friend, and they would unquestionably agree with me. But I don't know. It's for your generation.
Some economists argue that AI represents a genuine productivity revolution. Do you think that AI changes the assessment of the West's long-term growth prospects, or does it represent potentially more of a threat with regards to democratic concerns?
Well, I think it is perfectly plausible. I mean, I'd stress this. I use AI now a bit, like an enhanced Google. It's a great search engine if you use it very carefully, in my view. It still hallucinates. I mean, it does. Or at least I've had recent experience with the model I've been using. Anyway, I think my answer to your question is I think it's very, very plausible that AI will be both. That is to say, uh, uh, it is plausible from what I see, and it now seems to be particularly obvious in the area of coding, of all things. I can remember 10, 20 years ago, every wise old man told young people they should learn to code. And now we suddenly discover it's useless. It's really rather dramatic. Uh, so I think the idea that AI will generate large productivity improvements, particularly in our service sector. In not the the service sector consists of two completely different activities. One is actually looking after people. There, I think it's going to be very difficult for robots to replace mothers, for example, or school teachers or whatever. But if you're looking at processing information in finance, uh, any back office activity, anything like that. Yeah, I can perfectly well imagine AI doing all that. It's a development of the computer revolution, but a very profound one. And that could generate clearly very large further improvements in productivity and a shift in the nature of what we do. Um, and that could liberate growth. I remain, as I should be, a skeptic in the right sense, because huge increases in productivity are very difficult. I mean, we've had the digital revolution now. The computer revolution started in the 60s, but we've had radical transformations in technology over the last, let's say, 40 years or so. The internet, everything that went with the internet, the personal computer before that. I had my first personal computer in the early 80s, and we don't see in the data, though there are questions about measurement, a productivity revolution. So it is, and one of the reasons for that, I think, is raising productivity across a whole economy is much more difficult than many people realize. And many people don't realize how many revolutions we needed at the same time to get the sort of productivity growth we got from in the 20th century. Particularly in the middle of the 20th century. There were so many revolutions, energy revolutions, pharmaceutical revolutions, the chemical industry, all of these things. So I'm not convinced, but it could be. At the same time, if it is a revolution, it will create fantastically powerful political challenges, threats. It could further undermine, if not destroy, our media universe completely, and make it impossible to control and manage the proliferation of fakes, frauds, false news of every kind, completely credibly. So that's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And without reliable information, you can't have a democracy. You just can't. Without trusted, reliable, not just reliable, but trusted information, you can't have a democracy. So this is terrifying. And the second thing that's terrifying is that AI will replace what is most precious about human beings. Not the only thing, there are other things about them, which is our role as the thinkers, the creators, the what is special about humanity, what makes us really different, is that we are social and we think together and we create together. Now, if this is going to be taken over increasingly by machines, I fear that this will create a profound loss of belief in ourselves. And that could be even worse. So it seems to me it is possible that AI will transform the economy. I'm not sure. But it is also possible that it will have devastating negative effects we're quite unprepared for, socially, and we have no control over what is going on here, and it disturbs me a great deal. So that's my assessment of where we are.
The dollar's role as the global reserve currency has long been described as a sort of exorbitant privilege, but also as a structural anchor for the rules-based order. Um, as Washington is increasingly moving toward the more weaponization of commerce and currency, do you think that there's a risk that the US is gradually undermining this instrument of its own dominance? And what would a world of fragmented reserve currencies look like?
Very good questions. I think these are relatively, well, the first part is relatively simple. It is plausible, it seems to me, not merely plausible, it's obviously happening, that we're living in a world where everybody feels they have to hedge against the US because the US has ceased to be as reliable as they thought it was. And this is true in multiple domains. As a trade partner, as an investment partner, as a security partner, and as the provider of the dominant world currency, all of them. Because in different ways, we don't know what the US is going to do next. And that's partly because they've elected a president who himself doesn't know what he's going to do next. So how could it be otherwise? And who is deeply uninterested in the very notion of being predictable and reliable. To him, being unpredictable and unreliable is the game. So in this situation, hedging against the US clearly makes sense, and that was very much what Mark Carney was talking about when he talked about the rupture. It comes back to where we started when I talked about the destabilizing force of Donald Trump. Now, the so people will hedge. However, giving up the US altogether is impossible. It's such a central power across so many domains, particularly for its allies, and therefore particularly for Europe, given its role since the Second World War and in the Cold War and thereafter. We can't get rid of it tomorrow, and that applies not least to the dollar. It is the US has the advantage of the dominant financial markets, the dominant financial institutions, the most liquid currency, and the most accepted one. And it's much more than just the reserve holdings, which are important, but you can imagine other reserve assets. But the key thing is, where do you transact? How do you make payments and so forth? And getting out of the US, the dollar area completely is impossible because we're always going to want to deal with the US. My guess, however, is that we will move to fragmentation in that people will increasingly, and I think it's already obvious, hold other liabilities. The most obvious ones are European ones. And there's a problem, a very big problem, that Europe doesn't have a single financial market and a single debt instrument, a public debt instrument. There is no equivalent of US treasuries in Europe. That comes back to what we talked about earlier, fragmentation. Um, Obviously, holding a parcel of different European countries' debt, any of which is likely, with very few exceptions, to be seen as moderately insecure, is not the same as holding US treasuries. People have believed, that there's no default risk here. The so the Europeans debt of European countries is an alternative, but it has real disadvantages. And the financial markets of Europe are fragmented themselves. They're not as liquid. And so inevitably, the Eurozone is not seen as a substitute in currency. If we're focusing on currency and debt, and they're very closely related for the US. China is an enormous important trading partner, so people are interested in using the yuan, renminbi in payments for goods and services with China, but it's not a convertible currency. It doesn't have a large, liquid, open financial market. The Chinese definitely don't want that to happen because it weakens their control over their economy. And that would be a big step towards weakening control of the state over China. So China will also have fundamental structural problems. So my view is you can imagine a world in which people use the yuan renminbi more, above all for payment. People will use the euro, particularly in trade with Eurozone countries, and will hold the euro because it's safe. But both of these rivals have structural problems that I've described vis-a-vis the US. So unless the US does something crazy, which is possible, but not yet certainly not under Scott Bessent, who's very determined to preserve the dollar hegemony, is using stable coins for that purpose. I can't see a situation in the near future, 5, 10 years, by which I mean, in which the dollar is actually replaced by anything else. There is no replacement. But people will be hedging, and this will make financial markets more volatile. It makes crises more likely because there could be runs on institutions in particular countries, particularly the US. And so I think we are moving into a world of a degree of chaos. And the main symptom of chaos is instability. And that will tend to make people less willing to make long-term investment commitments, hold liabilities long-term, and it makes markets much more fragile. That's where I see it going.
Well, Martin Wolf, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.